All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show my friend Jennifer Schulp, Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I should mention that Jennifer and I recently ran into each other on the train going from Washington, D.C. up to New York City for the National Review Institute Conference, Innovation and Growth and Their New Enemies. I like that title because it reminded me of Virginia Pastrell's book, The Future and Its Enemies. Jennifer, what did you think of that conference?
I thought the conference was an interesting take on kind of where we're at this point. A lot of different speakers tackling a lot of different topics, from kind of thinking about how we think about workers, how we think about work, to kind of the more direct questions that I think about a little bit more. What does ESG mean for this? And how do we think about kind of populism in the American right? A lot of interesting ideas floating around that conference. I wish sometimes that we could talk in a little bit more detail than generalities.
Mm.
But sometimes generalities are good for a big group of people.
Yeah, no, I liked the small business panel they had, which included former small business administration administrator and wrestling impresario Linda McMahon, and a former guest of this show, Alfredo Ortiz of the Job Creators Network. And so they talked about people, starting small businesses and then, moving careers from being, a worker, a salaried person to being a owner, operator. And I think that you've also had a fascinating career and a trajectory, moving from the Department of Enforcement at FINRA, a financial regulator, to the Cato Institute, a libertarian organization that is famously skeptical of some of the efforts of regulators. What has what has that journey been like for you?
It's been fun. Say, I was a practicing lawyer for many years, and before I was at FINRA in the Department of Enforcement, I was doing private practice, representing kind of a wide variety of individuals and companies, mostly on the defense side. And your job in that circumstance is to find the best argument for your client. You want to be true to the law, so you want to be a zealous, accurate advocate, but your focus is on finding the best argument. When I moved to a financial regulator, my thought process was more trying to find the right answer rather than the best argument for why the regulator should win. The mindset shifts a little bit, and I found that very freeing. But after a lot of years at the regulator, it became obvious to me that the best outcome isn't always the best because you're constrained by the ways in which the rules are already written. And those rules often don't lead to the best outcomes, which made me want to get more involved in shaping the rules and thinking about the policies that define how the rules should be put into place, hence the move to somewhere like Cato. And I've really enjoyed the ability to sit back and think about how we should organize the system in order to really get the best outcomes for everyone, rather than just the best outcomes that are within the rule set that we have already existing.
See, that's fascinating because that reminds me of a conversation I had with a guy a year or two ago who's interested in these issues about, financial regulation and corporate governance and things like that. He's a very experienced litigator, and when we were talking about some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, I said, well, really what you should have is you should have different rules. This should be different, that should be different. We should pass a new law to do this, and we should reform this regulation. And he said, oh, that's really interesting, because I spent all of my time figuring out how to work within the current system, right? You have to defend each case based on the law that exists at the time. He's like, but you're out here just like changing the whole world in your mind.
And that's what I'm trying to do. It was very obvious. I thought that, I was proud of the work that I did in enforcement as a regulator. I thought hard about whether an outcome was fair and whether an outcome was something that could be predicted by the regulated parties. I thought about whether the punishment was just and whether the regulator should be bringing the case that it wants to bring. But when you got down to it, some of the rules just didn't make a lot of sense, and they could be predictable. The outcome could be just with that rule, but the rule wasn't doing anyone any favors. And it was not in my ability to say, well, we just should ignore that rule. Um, Now I can advocate for changing the rules in a more free way,
Mhm.
in a lot of different ways. Not only am I more free to advocate to change the rules, I hope to make the rules more free as well.
Mhm.
Um, but it is a lot of lawyers tend to be in the mindset of let's get the right answer, let's have the best outcome in the system that we have. And sometimes a client will want to work outside the box and try to change the rule. But as a lawyer, you're usually only empowered to do what the client wants to do. And being in a think tank, being somewhere like Cato, really allows you to listen to more perspectives and have more really take into account more views on the subject and think about a broader solution than just the one that suits your particular client at any given time.
Great. Now, you recently testified for the Senate Banking Committee on the now infamous meltdown of cryptocurrency exchange FTX and what's going on in crypto world in general. And the thing that to me really stood out about that was, something you said at the very beginning, which is that what happened at FTX shouldn't necessarily be hung around the neck of every cryptocurrency or blockchain project. FTX is very high profile, but that doesn't mean that what went wrong there is something that would go wrong with every other cryptocurrency company out there. What should we be learning from SBF and Caroline Ellison and those guys?
Well, I think the first lesson is kind of the one that you just highlighted, which is there are bad actors that can exist in the crypto world in as much as bad actors exist in the heavily regulated traditional financial world. It's trite to kind of point out the Bernie Madoff example, but he's one of many financial frauds in industries that are highly regulated and no one disputes the applicability of the rules to them. So the first lesson is there are bad actors that exist, and no amount of government regulation is going to prevent that type of activity from taking place somewhere in the ecosystem. So the second takeaway that I had from FTX was what I really tried to focus my testimony on in front of the Senate Banking Committee, which was we really can't talk about crypto as if it's one thing and that everything in crypto is the same and presents the same risks. And crypto is this one monolith that we can just solve for by coming up with one set of rules or one proclamation. When we're thinking about FTX in particular, FTX was what's known as a centralized crypto exchange,
Mhm.
which looks a lot like centralized financial intermediaries that exist in the traditional financial world. There's somebody in the middle that takes the money, does the transactions, and you have to trust that person in the middle to do their job correctly. A lot of crypto is looking towards decentralization, and in the exchange space in particular, there are such things as decentralized exchanges, where individuals interact through a software protocol in a much more peer-to-peer manner, where there is no individual in the middle that you have to trust to take the money or to hold the assets or to make the deals. And that's not risk-free, but it presents very different risks than centralized crypto intermediaries do. And when we're looking to regulate or think about what regulation should look like in this space, it's really important to treat different things differently.
Yeah, I guess that the idea, and I feel like people who study government regulation a lot have sort of seen this before, where uh, a new kind of novel challenge comes along, and the question is, oh, well, here's this new thing in the economy. What do we do with it? How do we, how do we pass rules around it? How do we make customers safe? But all of the people who are making the policy are existing in the old world, right? And so if you've spent, all the people who are experts now, who are, known in their field, who have been, doing their job for decades, they all grew up and live in the world of, traditional banking or traditional asset management. And so if those people are making the rules for a new technology, it's very tempting for them to put the sort of, round peg of crypto into the square hole of existing financial regulation. In the idea, it's, as some people in the space have said, like, well, why should we be regulating cryptocurrency with two statutes that were passed in 1933 and 1934, right? The two Securities and Securities Exchange Act that created the SEC. Why should we go into that paradigm for something that is supposed to be new and revolutionary?
Right. And it's important to ask the question as to whether or not the principles that are in the 33 and 34 Acts make sense when applied broadly. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I'm not someone that says, just because it's a really old law, it might not apply to something new. But it's important to ask the question of whether it does make sense. Say in the crypto space, Jack Soloway, who's a colleague of mine, and I put out a paper thinking about how you apply the 1933 Act to crypto tokens. And I say it's going to sound like a very similar argument that I just made to centralized and decentralized with respect to exchanges. But similarly, in the token space, you have centralized projects and projects that are decentralized or are trying to centralize. Securities regulation was mainly, the 33 Act, mainly put into place to kind of regulate the risks of a centralized party having asymmetrical information about the business that investors might not know. So where you have a centralized party that's making promises about the investment or that has access to information that investors might not have, it's appropriate to apply the types of securities laws that already exist. But those don't make a lot of sense in the decentralized space where there is no entity in the middle that is serving that same purpose. So there, I don't think the 1933 Act should apply. So it's important to stop and think again, crypto is not a monolith. There's a lot of different things happening in crypto, and sometimes the 33 Act, despite its age, might still have regulation that makes sense, but that's not a given, and we shouldn't be treating it like it is a given.
I feel like there's sort of an analogy here to the some of our friends who work in the telecom world, where you have, the FCC was originally there to stop radio broadcasters from interfering with each other, right? You have a limited broadcast spectrum and only so many people can broadcast at a certain time, and without anyone sort of setting up, kind of blockaded parameters along that spectrum, everyone would be trying to broadcast into everyone else's section of the spectrum and no one would be able to get their message out. But there's people today who say, oh, well, the FCC should take on regulation of the internet and all these other, every kind of mass media under the sun, because their analogy is, oh, well, they regulated an old type of mass media and they should regulate this new type of mass media because they should just regulate everything. But of course, the scarcity issue isn't there. The kind of structural, just a matter of physics, right, that they were taking on that sort of required them to do that at the beginning doesn't exist here. So you shouldn't just automatically roll that regulatory authority into every other kind of media without that sort of underlying necessity.
Right. And in the security space, we hear it a lot when SEC Chair Gary Gensler kind of gives his sloppy explanation as to what the securities laws are for, where he describes it as they're there to protect people who want to make money. That's way too broad of a brush for what the securities laws exist to protect. They don't regulate every single time someone wants to make money with their money. So it's important to think about, A, the purpose of the agency, and B, what the laws that already exist and have given authority to that agency countenance, and not just assume that just because something looks vaguely like something that's already regulated, it makes sense to regulate it the same way.
A good point. Now, here on the show, Free the Economy, we try to connect some of these big picture economic and political issues to the concerns that regular Americans have day to day. And, people see a headline in the news and they assume that it's only going to affect CEOs or billionaires, then they're probably not going to pay that much attention to it. What is the connection between finance regulations and congressional hearings and all that stuff and ordinary Americans trying to save for retirement?
Oh, I think it's a huge connection, and it depends on which part of financial regulation we're talking about, exactly where the connection is. But take, for example, something like crypto. Whether you are interested in saving for crypto for retirement, or you just want to access kind of the crypto world. You want to use crypto to engage in faster, cheaper payments, or you're interested in crypto because you want to have say, a digital native currency that you can use to transact in what we're calling Web3 these days, the new internet that's coming. These are everyday uses in the crypto space that, if financial regulation doesn't approach this question correctly, it's unduly harsh, it's unduly uncertain. It prevents entrepreneurs from being able to raise money or to run their businesses. This type of, say, financial activity, or really activity in the Web3 space, period, will find itself taking place all outside of American shores. Americans will have limited access to it potentially, but even if Americans don't have limited access, because it's awfully hard to ban something like crypto, even if they don't have limited access, the kind of development in that space won't be taking place here. It'll be taking place somewhere else, attracting talent from American shores and attracting investment from American shores as well. And that's a problem for the entire economy, not just for people that are interested in dabbling in crypto themselves. But we kind of think about it more broadly too, outside of the crypto space. So much of financial regulation, even when we're just talking about things like quote unquote investor protection, whatever that is supposed to mean exactly, all comes down to being able to have the financial system allocate money to the businesses that have the best ideas, that are meeting consumer demand in the best ways. And where financial regulation is too restrictive, people are not able to start their businesses, to grow their businesses. They're not able to create jobs. And we don't see the economy as a whole function. We don't have those jobs. We don't have those new inventions. We don't move forward. So financial regulation, getting it right, is, I think, one of the most important parts of kind of the regulatory scheme, because with financial regulation that doesn't work, not much else is going to work either, including your retirement savings.
Right. I know when when we talk about capitalism and what is capitalism versus any other economic system, we have, we often say like, oh, well, it just means that private parties are able to control, money and goods and the factors of production, and that just means that, we can own factories and stores, and, unlike the Soviet Union where only, the government owned everything. And so private ownership of capital is an important part of that, but it's not the only part, right? You need a financial, a legal environment that protects property rights and adjudicates disputes and things like that, so that capital can flow and people's investments can be protected Um, and so I think that sort of goes to your point where you need a sort of financial regulatory system to the extent that it is like policing in courts, stopping people from stealing and creating fraud. But obviously there's kind of an optimal point, right? And so if there's no financial regulation at all, you might have a lot of fraud. But if you have too much financial regulation, you stop capital formation, you stop investment, you stop new companies from being founded. So, I think there's people who would say that we are not quite to the optimum point, and they think we should have more financial regulation. I personally think we're probably far overshot that point. But this comes up all the time. My colleague John Burlow has written a lot about sort of previous waves of financial regulation, like the Dodd-Frank Act that came out after, around the time of the Great Recession, that put more requirements on things like auditing big corporations. But he's also pointed out that fewer companies have gone public since those greater burdens on public companies have been enacted. Companies wait far, far longer to go public than they used to. They used to go public when they're smaller. But that also meant more ordinary people like us, people who are not, billion-dollar, hedge fund or asset managers, can't get in on those innovative new companies at the early stage, right? Because they wait till they're worth, $10 billion before they go public. Whereas, Home Depot went public when I think they only had 12 stores or something like that, right?
Yep.
So that is, on the one hand, it's a big picture, big idea thing about what is regulation for, what is capitalism for, but it's also a very specific thing where small time investors don't get as good a chance to get in on the front end of new companies as they did probably 20 years ago.
They don't. And in fact, I actually just testified about this in front of the subcommittee of the House Financial Services, they were talking about reforming the accredited investor standard, which is exactly that rule that you referenced there, that the non-wealthy don't have the same access to investing in non-public companies. And that's a big problem. Over time, we've seen fewer and fewer public companies, as you noted. They tend to be more mature when they come to market, so they're past their high growth phases. And we've seen additional kind of concentration in the stock market among the largest companies, so that there's less opportunity for diversification in the public markets as well. The accredited investor standard really locks 90% of Americans out of investing in startups and other private companies who are potentially riskier because they're younger companies and they're still growing, but risk goes hand in hand with the potential for higher reward. And the problem with, there's a lot of problems with the accredited investor definition. Not only should the SEC not be telling people what they can and can't invest in with their own money, though the lines that it draws really reinforce existing wealth gaps in American society. And that's not just the gap between the rich and the less wealthy. The accredited investor definition hurts a lot of minority populations who are on average less wealthy than white populations, and hurts people who live in the middle of the country where salaries aren't as high. And it hurts not only their opportunities, like the individual investors' opportunities to get potentially higher risk, higher reward investments, or different diversification opportunities. It hurts entrepreneurs in those communities as well from being able to turn to the people that they know best to be able to finance their operations. One of the women that testified at the same time that I did during that hearing, Omi Bell, who's the founder of Black Girl Ventures, I think put it really well during her testimony when she said that if diversity is good for investment, it's good for investors too. And the accredited investor definition draws lines that make it impossible to have that type of diversity in our economy for both investors and entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of interrelated problems when financial regulation draws lines that, say, lock people out, and prevent capital from being able to flow freely in a way that it would be able to do more so without these types of regulations.
And I was thinking about just, of course, we just had the Super Bowl this weekend, that, if you had more ordinary Americans who were able to get into, investing in new companies, I think we might have more companies that are like the Green Bay Packers, famously owned by a large group of local shareholders, um, in the town. They're very proud of the fact that a lot of local fans there, season ticket holders, they're shareholders in the Packers, as opposed to virtually every other sports franchise, which is just owned by someone who is an already wealthy multi-billionaire, buys a new franchise, which is, the way most people have the sort of cliched view of finance in general, which is it's this game played by a tiny handful of extremely wealthy people, and that's the only constituency that matters. And that would be less the case if government and financial regulation and investing rules allowed more kind of ordinary Americans into the game.
Yeah, I think that's true. And well, I don't think it's always a perfect analog. When I think about the Super Bowl, I spent plenty of time watching every commercial for DraftKings that you could possibly see. There's a lot of people that are comfortable with risk, looking for higher reward. I think people need to be educated about risk reward and about the idea that not every bet is going to pay off. But you can see that there's plenty of people that are happy to take a chance. And if we had opportunities for them to take a chance on their fellow Americans' business in a better way, I think it's a more productive use of money. And the focus should be on helping people to understand the risks, understand the rewards, and let them make the decisions about what they should do with their own money.
Yeah, I mean, if all the guys on the Wall Street Bet subreddit are willing to put their money into GameStop and AMC, I think they should be able to put their money into like a new local startup. Well, we're heading to the end of our time, but I really want to quickly get into one thing that we've talked about in the past, and that's another hot topic, which is environmental, social, and governance, ESG investing. So you wrote a fascinating article for Law and Liberty last year in December that I thought made a really interesting distinction, and that is, before we talk about ESG, we need to distinguish ESG as a process and ESG as a product. What is the distinction there?
So the distinction there is that ESG as a process refers to simply incorporating factors that might be E or S or G into a traditional risk return analysis. That is ESG basically as we've always done risk return. It might not mean that all E is material or all S is material, but we're very familiar with figuring out how to determine whether or not something impacts a company's valuation or potential valuation at the end of the day. ESG as a product is kind of the newer version of ESG, where ESG is being sold as a means to change the world or to change company behavior. Investors are being asked to invest in ESG as a product in order to make the world greener or make the world more just. And I think that that's a very different type of investment. It's not as new as some people would like us to think. ESG is simply kind of in that vein, a new term for the broader concept of impact investing or socially responsible investing, all of which have been around for a long time. And it is not the case that impact investing leads to better returns. Impact investors are looking for different outcomes. And it's a different analysis when we think about how to incorporate ESG as a process versus ESG as a product. And conflating the two, I think, makes it very difficult to have the conversation about where regulation is appropriate, where regulation should focus, what type of regulation makes sense. We need to be very precise when we talk about ESG, something which has not been a priority for really anyone in the ESG space over the past decade or so.
I would say precision is not the first word that comes to mind when I think about ESG metrics. Okay, really quick. There's a question about whether ESG is an issue, or I just sometimes call, say, politicized investing. If people aren't familiar with that, the three letters. Is this going to continue being a sort of hot button political issue? Because it has been the case, it has been in a few states, in Texas and Florida. ESG investing in sort of related topics have been pretty controversial. And with the Republicans coming back in the majority in the House, so you now have the Republicans with the chairmanship of the majority of the House Financial Services Committee, and they will certainly have a lot to say about this stuff going forward. And hottest topic of all, noted ESG skeptic Vivek Ramaswamy, who's the founder of Strive Asset Management, has strongly hinted that he is running for president at some point, if not in 2024. So what do you think of all that? Is it too wonky of an issue to be really mainstream, or is it something that kind of regular Americans are going to get even more riled up about?
So I wish it were too wonky of an issue, because I think in actuality it is a pretty wonky issue, and that we need to be having a lot more of a kind of rational, heat turned down conversation about it. I don't think that's where we're headed. I think it's going to remain a political hot topic, in part because the concepts that we hear about in ESG, particularly climate change and a lot of these social justice areas, are hot political topics independently. And it's very easy to continue that conversation in the investing space where there's clear money involved. So I would say there hasn't been a lot of interest in having the wonky discussion. I think it's a lot easier to have the political discussion where folks on both sides of the aisle play up the political aspects of the underlying designs in ESG in order to, let's say, score political points, engage in the culture war. And I think it's unfortunate, because one of the beauties of, say, capitalism in this space is that investors should be free to make their own choices about how they want to invest. If they're interested in investing in an impact fund, they should be able to do that. And whether that impact fund is looking to take on right causes or left causes, it shouldn't make a difference. And a lot of this politicization has been aimed at trying to reduce choices writ large. And while I think that there are areas that we can focus on in ESG, there are a lot more wonkier topics that aren't going to get the interest of kind of the state legislature in Texas, or the political platform for a potential presidential nominee. I wish we could turn the heat down and actually talk about some of the deeper issues that will allow choice to flourish if done correctly, rather than limiting choice.
That's great. I know that reminds me of one of my favorite alternate definition of those three letters. Now former SEC Commissioner Elliot Roisman said in a speech, ESG should stand for everybody stop grandstanding.
I completely agree.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us. This is a fantastic interview. And just tell everyone, where can people find you and your writing and all your stuff?
Sure. So all of my writing always appears on the Cato website, www.cato.org, but you can also follow me on Twitter at Jennifer J. Schulp. Also a lot of activity there. So thanks.
A great follow, by the way. All right. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.